They thought firing her would be easy. A quick meeting, a calm announcement, security at the door, cameras rolling for good optics. But what they didn't know, what they couldn't have known, was that the woman standing at the head of that table had spent 18 months building an invisible fortress around herself. And the moment they tried to push her out, every door they thought they controlled locked them in. There are moments in life where everything looks normal on the surface, but underneath, the ground is already crumbling. This is a story about one of those moments. A story about a woman who walked into a room knowing she was about to be destroyed, and walked out having destroyed nothing, but revealed everything. Let me take you to Chicago. A Tuesday morning in autumn. The kind of day where the light comes through the windows just right, making everything look clean and professional and perfectly in order. The headquarters of a Fortune 500 company, glass and steel, modern architecture, the kind of building that makes you feel small when you stand in its lobby. On the 43rd floor, there's a boardroom. All glass walls. You can see the city stretching out in every direction. You can also see everyone inside, which is exactly the point. And on this particular morning, that boardroom was about to become a stage. The glass walls and silent witnesses. Picture this, a long table, polished to a mirror shine. 14 chairs. 12 of them filled with executives in tailored suits, perfectly pressed shirts, faces that had practiced looking serious in meetings like this for decades. At one end of the table sat Edward Carlyle, the interim board chair. Silver hair, expensive watch. The kind of man who'd built his career on knowing how to smile while delivering bad news. At the other end stood Naomi Brooks. She wasn't sitting. That's the first thing you need to understand. While everyone else settled into their leather chairs, she stood. Not because she was nervous. Not because she was making a statement. But because she knew something they didn't. When you're about to be pushed, it's better to already be on your feet. Naomi was 42 years old. Black woman in a world that still acted surprised every time someone who looked like her made it to the top. She'd spent 20 years climbing a ladder that other people kept trying to pull up behind her. She'd been the first Black executive at this company, the first Black woman on the board. And 2 years ago, she'd become the first Black CEO. They'd celebrated her appointment. Press releases. News coverage. The company's stock photo library suddenly had diversity. Everyone smiled for the cameras and talked about progress and new chapters. But Naomi had been around long enough to know the difference between being welcomed and being tolerated. And lately, the tolerance had been wearing thin. A career built on breaking ceilings. Let me tell you how she got there, because it matters. Naomi didn't come for money. She came from Detroit. Her mother cleaned houses. Her father worked night shifts at an auto plant until the plant closed, and he worked night shifts at a warehouse instead. She was the first person in her family to finish college. Got a scholarship to Northwestern. Studied business and economics because she was good with numbers and because she understood something early that a lot of people never learn. Money is just another language, and if you can speak it fluently enough, people have to listen. She started at the bottom. Analyst positions. Grunt work. She'd be in the office until midnight running models while other people took credit in morning meetings. But she didn't just work hard, she worked smart. She saw patterns other people missed. She understood that corporate power wasn't just about titles and salaries. It was about information. About knowing which doors to knock on, and which conversations to overhear, and which numbers told the real story. By her 30s, she was a vice president. By her late 30s, she was the CFO. And when the previous CEO retired, suddenly, quietly, with rumors that nobody wanted to confirm, the board had a problem. They needed someone clean. Someone competent. Someone who could stabilize things while they figured out their next move. They needed Naomi. So they gave her the job. And for 2 years, she did exactly what they hired her to do. She cleaned up the mess. She steadied the ship. Revenue grew. Stock prices climbed. Quarterly reports looked beautiful. From the outside, everything was perfect. But from the inside, Naomi could feel it. The way certain board members stopped including her in informal conversations. The way Edward started scheduling meetings without her, then apologizing later like it was an accident. The way her recommendations would get delayed, questioned, revised by people who didn't understand half of what she did. They were looking for a reason. Any reason. And when they couldn't find one that would hold up, they decided they didn't need one. The whispers that turned to plans. It started small. Little comments in closed-door sessions. Concerns about cultural fit. Questions about whether her leadership style was sustainable. You know, the kind of vague language that sounds professional but doesn't actually mean anything except, "We want her gone." Edward was leading the charge. He'd been passed over for CEO when Naomi got the job, and he'd smiled through it like a good soldier, but everyone knew he'd been furious. He was supposed to be next in line. He'd been grooming himself for that position for 15 years. And then the board handed it to her instead. He never said it out loud, of course. Men like Edward never do. But Naomi could read a room better than anyone, and she could read him like large print. Every time he praised her in a meeting, it sounded like he was eulogizing someone. Every time he asked for her input, it felt like he was documenting her mistakes. The other board members followed his lead. Not all of them, there were a few who stayed neutral, maybe even sympathetic, but enough of them. Enough to form a majority. Enough to call a vote. Naomi knew it was coming. She'd known for months. You don't survive in corporate America as a black woman by being naive. You survive by being 3 steps ahead. So when her assistant told her about this special board meeting scheduled for Tuesday morning, she didn't ask what it was about. She already knew. The invitation. The email came on a Friday afternoon. Subject line. Board meeting, Tuesday, 9 a.m. No agenda attached. No explanation. Just the time and the room number, and a line at the bottom asking her to please confirm attendance.
It was polite.
Professional. Exactly the kind of message you'd send to someone you were about to fire. Naomi stared at her screen for a long time. Her office was quiet. Through the windows, she could see the city below. People moving through their lives, unaware that 43 floors above them, someone's career was being dismantled with perfect corporate courtesy. She could have ignored it. She could have gotten a lawyer, fought back preemptively, made noise. But that would have been playing their game by their rules. And Naomi had learned something a long time ago. When people think they've already won, they get careless. So she replied, "Confirmed. See you Tuesday." And then she started preparing. Not the way they expected, not with lawyers and press statements and desperate phone calls to board allies.
No.
Naomi prepared the way she'd been preparing for 18 months. Quietly.
Carefully. Piece by piece.
Because here's what they didn't know. Naomi had seen this coming long before that Friday email. She'd seen it the day she accepted the CEO position. She'd looked at the faces around that table and understood exactly what she was walking into. A temporary solution. A placeholder. A black woman given power only until it became convenient to take it back. She set her briefcase down. She didn't sit. She stood at her end of the table and waited. Edward cleared his throat. Smiled that practiced smile.
Naomi.
Thank you for coming. Like she had a choice. The board has been conducting a review, he continued, voice smooth and rehearsed. And after careful consideration, we've made the difficult decision that the company needs to move in a different direction. We appreciate your service, but effective immediately, your position as CEO is terminated. Different direction. Effective immediately. All the corporate euphemisms for "we're firing you," and we don't have to explain why. Around the table, nobody moved. Nobody objected. A few people looked uncomfortable, but not uncomfortable enough to say anything. Naomi waited for him to finish. Waited for the pause where she was supposed to accept this quietly, maybe ask about severance, maybe thank them for the opportunity. That's what they expected. That's what would make this easy. Instead, she asked one question. The question no one expected. On what grounds? 3 words.
Come. Direct.
No emotion behind them. Edward blinked. He hadn't expected pushback. I'm sorry. On what grounds are you terminating my position? Naomi kept her voice level. You mentioned a review. What were the findings? What performance metrics did I fail to meet? What breach of contract or fiduciary duty am I being accused of? The room went very quiet. Edward shifted in his seat. This isn't about accusations, Naomi. It's about direction. About what's best for the company moving forward.
So no grounds, she said.
No documented cause. No evidence presented. Just a vote to remove a sitting CEO from a position they've performed successfully for 2 years. The board has the authority. The board has authority granted by the corporate charter. Naomi interrupted, and now there was something in her voice. Not anger. Something colder. Which requires certain procedures for the removal of executive officers. Procedures that include documentation, notification, and the opportunity to respond to specific charges. Edward's smile was starting to crack. We've followed all necessary procedures. Have you? She reached into her briefcase,
Pulled out her phone.
set it on the table, and checked the time, 9:17 a.m. Then you won't mind, she said quietly, if we make sure. And she pressed a button. Somewhere in the building, something changed. You couldn't hear it.
Couldn't see it yet.
But it was happening. Like the first crack in a dam before the water comes through. Edward kept talking, trying to regain control. Naomi, this decision is final. We're going to have to ask you to collect your personal items and... His phone buzzed. Then another board member's phone. Then another. Naomi stood perfectly still, watching them check their screens. Watching confusion turn to concern turn to something close to fear. What? Edward looked up. What is this? That, Naomi said, is every executive access code in this building being frozen pending compliance review. That's all board member accounts being flagged for audit. That's a regulatory investigation being triggered by an attempted termination that violates about 14 different corporate governance protocols. She picked up her phone, turned it so they could see the screen. Red alerts. System locks. Official notifications from the SEC and the company's own compliance department. The question isn't whether you have the authority to fire me, Naomi said. The question is whether you ever actually had the authority you thought you did. And in that moment, in that glass room with the whole city watching through the windows, 12 board members realized they'd made a terrible mistake. They'd underestimated her. They'd assumed she was powerless. They'd thought this would be simple. But Naomi Brooks had spent 18 months building something they couldn't see. And now, with one button press, she'd brought the whole structure down around them. The real story was just beginning. There's a specific kind of silence that falls over a room when powerful people realize they've lost control. It's not the silence of peace or agreement. It's the silence of people frantically trying to understand what just happened while their brains are still catching up to reality. That's the silence that filled the boardroom at 9:18 a.m. on that Tuesday morning. 12 board members staring at their phones. Red alerts multiplying across their screens. Edward Carlyle frozen mid-sentence, his carefully prepared statement suddenly meaningless. And Naomi Brooks, still standing at her end of the table, perfectly calm, watching it all unfold exactly the way she knew it would. Because here's the thing about traps. The best ones don't look like traps until they've already closed. The button. Let me take you back to that moment, the moment Naomi pressed the button on her phone. To everyone else in the room, it looked like a small gesture. Maybe she was checking a message. Maybe she was recording the meeting for her own protection. They barely noticed it because they were too focused on their own script, their own plan for how this morning would go. But that button wasn't just recording anything. It was executing a command. A single instruction that Naomi had programmed 18 months earlier, waiting for the exact right moment to activate it. What did it do? It triggered a cascade of automated protocols buried deep in the company's governance systems. Protocols that most of the board didn't even know existed because they'd never bothered to read past page 12 of the corporate bylaws. Protocols that Naomi, as CEO and former CFO, had carefully, legally, quietly put in place. The first thing that happened was a compliance freeze. Every executive account in the building, emails, internal systems, financial access, everything locked. Not permanently. Just suspended pending review. Standard procedure when there's a potential governance violation. The kind of thing that's supposed to protect companies from internal corruption or hostile takeovers. The second thing was an automatic notification to the SEC. Because publicly traded companies have rules about how they can remove CEOs. You can't just vote someone out in a closed-door meeting without proper documentation and shareholder notification. And this meeting? This meeting had been called with minimal notice, no stated cause, no documentation provided to the CEO being terminated. The third thing, and this is where Naomi's brilliance really shows, was an internal audit trigger. Every communication, every email, every text message between board members for the past 6 months was automatically flagged for review by the company's own legal and compliance department. Not by Naomi. Not by anyone with a personal stake. By the company's own mechanisms for preventing exactly the kind of corporate malfeasance that was currently happening in that glass room. All of this happened in about 90 seconds. And Naomi stood there, watching their faces change as they realized the walls were closing in. The freeze. Edward was the first to understand. You could see it in his eyes. That moment when arrogance turns to panic. He started, then stopped. Looked at his phone again. Tried to open his email. Access denied. Tried to call someone. Line disconnected. This is illegal. You can't lock us out of our own systems. I didn't lock you out, Naomi said calmly. The compliance protocols did. The same protocols that exist to prevent board members from making decisions that could expose the company to legal liability. Which is exactly what you were attempting to do. We have every right to terminate. On what grounds? Naomi repeated. You keep saying you have the right, but you haven't answered the question. What is the documented cause for my termination? Because according to my contract, which was drafted by this board, I can only be removed for cause. Gross negligence. Breach of fiduciary duty. Criminal conduct. Show me the cause. Silence. One of the board members, a woman named Patricia Chun, spoke up. Her voice was shaky. Edward said there were performance concerns. Issues with strategic direction. Did he show you documentation of those concerns? Naomi asked. Performance reviews? Quarterly assessments? Any actual evidence? Patricia looked at Edward. Edward said nothing. Because I have documentation, Naomi continued. 24 months of quarterly reports showing revenue growth, stock price increases, successful product launches, improved employee retention. Every metric you told shareholders you cared about, I improved it. So again, what's the cause? Another board member, James Rodriguez, cleared his throat. Naomi, I think there's been a misunderstanding. Maybe we moved too quickly. There's no misunderstanding. Naomi cut him off. Not rudely. Just firmly. You planned this. You scheduled this meeting. You brought security guards. You set up a camera to document my removal. This wasn't a mistake. This was deliberate. She gestured to the guards still standing by the door, looking increasingly uncomfortable. You can tell them to leave, by the way. Because I'm not going anywhere. Not until this is resolved properly. Edward tried one more time. The board has authority under the charter. The board has authority granted by the shareholders, Naomi corrected. And shareholders have a right to know when you're trying to remove a CEO who's been performing successfully. They have a right to understand why. They have a right to vote on it. None of which happened here. More phones buzzing. More alerts. Now people were getting calls from the legal department, from the company's external counsel, from compliance officers who were suddenly very interested in what was happening on the 43rd floor. And through it all, Naomi stood there. Not gloating. Not celebrating. Just present.
Solid.
Unshakable. Because this wasn't even the real revelation yet. The freeze, the audit, the alerts, that was just the opening move. The real checkmate was still coming. 18 months of silence. There's something else you should know, Naomi said into the growing chaos. Her voice was quiet, but everyone heard it. Something I've been waiting to tell you, for quite some time. She reached into her briefcase again. This time, she pulled out a manila folder.
Thick.
Heavy. The kind that holds a lot of paper and even more secrets. When I accepted the CEO position 2 years ago, she began, I did my due diligence. I reviewed the corporate structure, the ownership records, the voting shares, and I found something interesting. She opened the folder, started laying documents on the table. One by one. Legal papers, trust agreements, stock certificates, This company has been around for 70 years, she continued. And in that time, ownership has changed hands multiple times. Shares have been divided, consolidated, put into trusts, transferred to holding companies. It's complicated. Most people don't bother to trace it all the way through. But I did. Edward was staring at the papers. What is this? This, Naomi said, is the real ownership structure of this company. Not the simplified version we show to investors. The complete version. Every trust, every holding company, every proxy agreement. She pulled out one specific document, set it directly in front of Edward. And this is documentation showing that 18 months ago, I legally purchased controlling interest in several of those trusts. Not enough to trigger SEC disclosure requirements. That's why nobody noticed. But enough to give me effective voting control over approximately 38% of the company's shares. The room went dead silent. You're lying, Edward said.
But his voice was weak.
Am I? Naomi looked at him. Call the transfer agent. Check the trust documents. It's all legal, all properly filed. I used my own money, severance from my previous positions, stock options I'd accumulated over 20 years, some careful investments. I didn't steal anything. I just bought what was available. Patricia was reading through the documents now, her face going pale. This can't be right. If you controlled that much, I'd have to be consulted on major decisions?
Yes.
I'd have veto power over certain board actions? Also yes. Including, Naomi said, looking directly at Edward, the removal of executive officers without cause. James was shaking his head. Why didn't you disclose this? I disclosed everything I was legally required to disclose, Naomi replied. The shares are held through independent trusts. My name isn't on them directly. But the trust documents, which are public record, by the way, you just have to know where to look, clearly show the chain of control. I didn't hide anything. You just never bothered to check. She let that sink in for a moment. So here's where we are, she continued. You tried to fire me without cause, which violates my contract. You tried to do it without proper shareholder notification, which violates SEC regulations. You tried to do it despite the fact that I control enough voting shares to block such an action. And you did all of this on camera with witnesses, creating a permanent record of corporate governance violations. The documents. Naomi walked slowly around the table now. Not threatening. Just present. She stopped behind Edward's chair. For 18 months, she said, I watched you plan this. I watched you have private meetings. I watched you build your coalition. I watched you practice the speech you just gave. And the whole time I was building something too. Not out of anger. Not out of revenge. But because I knew I have always known that in rooms like this, people who look like me don't get the benefit of the doubt. We don't get second chances. We get one shot to prove we belong, and the moment we stumble, the moment we show weakness, it's over. She placed her hand on the back of Edward's chair. He flinched. So I didn't stumble, Naomi said. I didn't show weakness. I did my job brilliantly. I improved every single metric. I made shareholders money. And while I was doing that, I was also making sure that if this day ever came, if you ever tried to push me out for no reason other than your own egos and prejudices, I'd be ready. She moved back to her end of the table, stood there, silhouetted against the windows and the city beyond. The documents in front of you prove ownership. The alerts on your phones prove violations. The camera in the corner has recorded everything. So now you have a choice. You can acknowledge that this termination was improper and reinstate me immediately. Or you can fight this, and I will use every legal tool at my disposal, including my voting shares, my documentation, and that video footage, to ensure that every single person at this table faces consequences for attempting an illegal termination. Her voice never rose, never wavered. She wasn't threatening them. She was simply explaining reality. What's it going to be? The collapse. Edward Carlyle was a man who'd spent 40 years learning how to win, how to negotiate, how to dominate rooms like this. But in that moment, looking at Naomi Brooks standing there with all the evidence of his failure spread out on the table in front of him, he had nothing left. His carefully constructed plan had fallen apart. His authority had evaporated. His confidence, that unshakable certainty that he was smarter, better, more deserving than the woman they'd made CEO, all of it crumbled. This is... He started but couldn't finish. Over, Naomi said. This is over. Patricia was already standing up. I move that we table this discussion pending a full review of the documentation and legal consultation. Second, James said quickly. Other board members started agreeing. Suddenly, everyone was very interested in procedure, in doing things properly, in making sure they followed all the rules they'd been perfectly happy to ignore 20 minutes earlier. Edward just sat there, staring at the papers, at the phone alerts, at the camera that had recorded his attempt to remove Naomi and her systematic dismantling of that attempt. Edward, Patricia said, we need to adjourn this meeting. He looked up at her,
Then at Naomi.
and for just a second, she saw something in his eyes. Not hatred, not anger, something worse. The realization that he'd underestimated her so completely that he'd destroyed himself. Meeting adjourned, he said quietly. The board members filed out. Some of them wouldn't meet Naomi's eyes. A few nodded at her, respect, maybe, or fear, or just acknowledgement that she'd beaten them at a game they thought only they knew how to play. The security guards left without being told to. And then it was just Naomi and Edward in that glass room. You planned this from the beginning, he said. It wasn't a question. No, Naomi replied. I hoped I'd never need it. I hoped you'd see my performance and judge me on merit. I hoped I could just do my job. But I'm a black woman in corporate America, Edward.
Hope isn't a strategy.
Preparation is. She picked up her briefcase, started gathering the documents. You're going to resign, she said. Not asking.
Telling.
Am I? Within the week, you're going to announce that you're stepping down from the board to pursue other opportunities. Several of your allies will do the same. Not all at once, that would look suspicious. But over the next few months, this board is going to change. And the people who replace you will be people who understand that this company needs to move forward, not backward. Edward laughed. It was a bitter sound. And if I don't, then I release the full video of this meeting to every major news outlet. I file formal complaints with the SEC. I use my voting shares to call a special shareholder meeting and present evidence of board misconduct. And I make sure everyone knows that you tried to fire a successful black CEO for no documented reason, and that you were willing to break multiple laws to do it. She closed her briefcase, looked at him one last time. Your choice, Edward. But make it quick. Because unlike you, I actually have work to do. The return. 5 days later, Edward Carlyle announced his resignation. Personal reasons. Family commitments. The usual corporate euphemisms for I was forced out. 3 other board members followed over the next month. The SEC review found irregularities in board procedures and recommended reforms. The company implemented them immediately. Naomi personally oversaw the changes. And on a Monday morning, 3 weeks after the meeting that was supposed to end her career, Naomi walked back into that same boardroom for a regularly scheduled board meeting. Different faces around the table now.
Some old, some new.
People who'd been through the fire and learned from it. People who understood that respect wasn't about optics, it was about recognizing competence regardless of what it looked like. Naomi sat down at the head of the table. Not standing this time.
Sitting.
Comfortable. In her rightful place.
Good morning, she said.
Let's get started. And they did. No drama. No tension. Just work. The work she'd been hired to do. The work she was excellent at. The work that, for now at least, she could do without having to constantly watch her back. But she kept the documents. Kept the evidence. Kept the systems she'd built. Because she knew, would always know, that being excellent wasn't enough. That working hard wasn't enough. That even when you win, you have to stay ready for the next fight. Because power doesn't vanish. It just waits. And the people who understand that, who prepare for it, who build their fortresses quietly while everyone else is busy underestimating them, those are the people who survive. What power really means. The story spread, of course. Stories like this always do. Not the official version, That stayed carefully corporate, carefully sanitized. But the real version, the one about the black woman CEO who walked into a room full of people trying to fire her and walked out with their resignations instead. People asked Naomi about it in interviews. How did she stay so calm? How did she plan it all so perfectly? Wasn't she angry? Wasn't she afraid? And Naomi always gave the same answer. I was terrified. Every single day. But fear and preparation aren't opposites. Fear is what drives preparation, and preparation is what turns fear into power. She talked about the 18 months she'd spent building her defense, the long nights reviewing corporate documents, the careful investments, the legal consultations that had to stay quiet because if anyone found out what she was planning, they would have stopped her before she finished. People think power is about being loud, she said in one interview.
About dominating.
About forcing others to bend to your will. But real power, lasting power, is about understanding the system better than the people trying to use it against you. It's about being so thoroughly prepared that when they finally make their move, you've already won. The interviewer asked if she felt vindicated. Naomi thought about that for a moment. Vindication suggests you were doubted and proven right. I was never doubted. My work spoke for itself. What I was dismissed, assumed to be temporary, treated like I was lucky to be there rather than qualified to lead. And what I proved wasn't that I was right. What I proved was that underestimating someone because of how they look is the most expensive mistake you can make. She smiled then. Not a bitter smile. Not a triumphant one. Just the smile of someone who'd fought a battle she never wanted to fight and won it anyway. The real lesson, Naomi continued, isn't about me. It's about every woman, every person of color, every person who's ever been in a room where people assumed they didn't belong. It's about understanding that you can't wait for fairness. You can't hope for recognition. You have to build your own fortress. You have to know your own worth so deeply that when they try to take it from you, you can show them, calmly, legally, undeniably, that they never had the power to take anything in the first place. The interview ended. The camera turned off. And Naomi went back to work. Epilogue, the glass room. Sometimes, late at night when the building is quiet and the city lights stretch out below her office window, Naomi thinks about that day. The meeting. The moment Edward's face changed. The sound of phones buzzing with alerts nobody expected. She doesn't regret it. But she doesn't celebrate it either. Because victory against injustice isn't really victory, it's just survival. It's just making sure you live to fight another day. The glass boardroom is still there. She walks past it sometimes. Empty now except for tables and chairs. But if you stand there long enough, if you let yourself remember, you can almost see them. The 12 board members who thought they held all the cards, and the one woman who showed them what power really looks like. It doesn't shout. It doesn't threaten. It doesn't need to. It simply is. Patient. Prepared. Unshakable. And when the moment comes, when you're standing in a room full of people who want you gone, it reveals itself not through force, but through truth. The truth that you were never the one who was powerless. They were. They just didn't know it until it was too late. Naomi Brooks still serves as CEO. The company is thriving. The board has been reformed. And somewhere in a secure file in her office, she keeps a folder of documents. Just in case. Because the fight isn't ever really over. There's always another Edward. Another room. Another moment where someone will look at you and decide you don't belong. But now she knows, and more importantly, they know, that belonging was never something they got to decide. She decided. She prepared. She won. And that glass boardroom? It's not a place where she was almost defeated. It's a place where she taught the world a lesson about what happens when you mistake silence for weakness and preparation for luck. Power doesn't vanish, she'd said. It waits for the truth to arrive. And that morning, in that room with 12 witnesses and one camera rolling, the truth arrived right on time.